What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and I want to cover the current run of the Eternals. We're only about 3 issues in, and it's a monthly series, so it's one comic every month. So it'll probably be kind of a slow-going thing, but the story's really cool so far, and I'm curious to see how you guys would respond to it. But one of the things this does is this basically opens up with Icarus essentially being revived. Now, to give you guys a little bit of context here, and this is exceedingly important, we go more in-depth into this in our Eternals Explained video, so make sure you check that out. It'll be linked down in the description. But the whole point behind this is that the Eternals originally believed that their modus operandi, right, the reason why they existed in the first place, is because the Celestials had appeared on Earth and they had basically modified the genes of early man, and part of that modification resulted in the Eternals. But the Eternals existed to basically kind of safeguard humanity, to guide humanity, because that was part of the Celestial experiment, and the idea was that the genes of a portion of early man had been modified so that in the future they would develop powers. And so the Eternals essentially protected humanity from the Deviants, and so that's why the Eternals and the Deviants were always at war. The thing that kind of leads into this, and the story that really kind of gives us the explanation for why Icarus is being revived in the first place, came in all new, all different Avengers. And this was basically the revelation of the Dark Celestials. Now, that story built on a previous story, but the two kind of go hand in hand. And the complete kind of event that was given to us here was that the reality of the Eternals' existence was to basically be like a lid on a petri dish, right? That the truth about the Celestial experiment was that every planet they visit and every planet they experiment on will be destroyed, right? It's only a matter of time before it is. And the way this works is you have the Celestials and then you have the Horde. And the Celestials kind of represent absolute good, so to speak. And that's a loose term that I use, but it's the closest we get if we compare it to like morality in comparison to what Jack Kirby originally wanted to do with the Eternals in the old stories he did back in 1976. And then the Horde kind of represent absolute evil. And the energies of both of these groups are fed on by a being called the Fulcrum. And so the way this works is that when an experiment is conducted on a planet by the Celestials, a portion of those genes are modified so that at a future point in time, they'll develop powers. Hence the reason you get mutants in Marvel Comics. After some predated amount of time, which is described as 19 cycles, I don't know how that compares to real world time, then what happens is the Celestials go back and then they basically harvest the planet. And if the energy of that planet matches the energy signal of the Deviants, then all the energy of that planet goes to the Horde, which is just kind of like an evil group that exists out there. If the energy of that planet matches the energy of the Eternals, then it goes to the Celestials. And so it was a way to kind of maintain this balance between the Celestials and the Horde. Quite literally, they're vying for energy based on a particular planet. What this meant is the Eternals learned the truth of their existence. So they were basically just kind of security guards, just keeping humanity safe so it could be harvested at a future point in time. And even the Eternals themselves would be harvested at a future point in time. This basically led to the Eternals going insane and then killing each other, right? They just went nuts. Like, and some of them committed suicide. Most of them just took each other out, right? It was just like this insane level of existential crises that they just couldn't handle. And so the result is it was Marvel's way of just kind of killing off all the Eternals, just sort of stripping them from the entirety of the Marvel landscape, and presumably doing so they could reboot them at a future point in time, right? This was done less than a decade ago, and so I have to believe that Marvel was kind of gearing up for the possibility of them doing an Eternals film and just kind of setting the stage so they could bring them back adequately. And that's what happens here. And so the result of this is you end up having Icarus, who is essentially kind of resurrected in what's called the Exclusion Zone. Now, the Exclusion Zone serves a couple different purposes in the Eternals mythos. The first purpose is that when an Eternal dies, if a resurrection is going to happen, they resurrect them there. The second thing is that it serves as a prison. So if there is an Eternal that defects from the cause, right? If the Eternals are there to protect humanity and an Eternal comes along and says, no, we should enslave humanity, and then like goes on a campaign to kill as many humans as they can, they'll be locked away in the Exclusion. And they'll be left there until such a time as they either repent and understand the error of their ways and go forward as a proper Celestial, or they'll stay there until the end of all things, right? Presumably until like the world's destroyed or the Celestials cull the Eternals or whatever the case happens to be. In this instance, it's where Icarus is being resurrected. Now, when he comes back, he actually ends up coming across Zuros, and Zuros is now currently the Prime Eternal. And one of the things they talk about here is the idea of the One Mind. The One Mind is basically the Unimind, and kind of a quick synopsis or a quick explanation, again, based on what we talked about in our Eternals Explained video. The Unimind is basically when the Eternals come together and quite literally combine their minds and energy to create a singular gestalt energy source that basically makes decisions. It can also be used as a weapon, right? Like if a threat is dire enough, the Unimind can be formed, which is like the collective energy of all the Eternals, and is quite powerful in its own right. And so the decision was more or less made because Icarus is the last person to return. Icarus was previously the Prime Eternal, or the leader of the Eternals. Because he was the last to die, he's the last to be resurrected. And that in that time frame, the Unimind was formed, and Zuros was chosen to be the leader. Now, in my mind, it always should have been Zuros who was the Prime Eternal, and the reason why is because he's one of the oldest Eternals in existence. And in fact, fact, I think him, outside of Alars, he is the oldest one. He's the oldest son of Kronos. But in effect, he's a second generation Eternal, more or less. And the reason why I say that matters is because given the history of the Eternals, if you guys check out my video on the Eternals Explained, that we basically talked about this idea that when they were first created by the Celestials, that what you had here was Kronos and Uranos. And Uranos incited conflict. He incited a civil war against the Eternals, and then in turn, he incited a civil war among the Eternals, which of course led to Uranos being defeated. Ultimately, he was cast off of Earth, and then eventually settled on Saturn's moon Titan, and then of course there was a great big huge civil war among those individuals. But Kronos had two sons on Earth. The first was Zuros, and the second was Alars. Alars, as you guys know, eventually went to Titan following the deaths of Uranos and his forces. He married Suisan, they had a couple kids. One was Eros, also known as Star Fox. The other was Dion, also known as Thanos. I never agreed with Marvel changing the name of Thanos to Dion. But the important thing here is that Zuros remained on Earth. And so as essentially the oldest Eternal, he always should have been the one to lead. I think in the end, Marvel basically chose Icarus just because of his popularity among comic book readers, but it makes sense that it would be Zuros here. And so it's one of those things that doesn't necessarily sit well with Icarus, but I think, again, it's a good call because Icarus is kind of headstrong, right? He's very brusque. He's not much in the way of a leadership style in terms of his personality. But at the end of the day, the choice was made and he simply has to follow it. And that's one of the things that's established here. When the Unimind makes a choice, the choice is made, and that's it. There's no arguing against that. If Icarus were to go to Zuros and say, no, you do not need to be the leader of the Eternals, I should be the leader of the Eternals, he'd be cast away to the exclusion zone. Because in effect, he's committing heresy against the Prime Eternal. And so again, it's just one of those things that he just kind of has to deal with. Now, in the midst of that, of course, as he's kind of traversing around and figuring out what's going on here, he ends up coming across Sprite. This is one of the funny things that Marvel Comics did. So the idea behind this is that Sprite was originally a guy. Marvel switched him up to a girl. I'm sure there'll be comic book fans who are going to be mad about it. I don't really know why. It's not like they could give me the history of Sprite without looking up a Wikipedia article in the first place. So they're basically mad about something they don't really know anything about. But at the end of the day, I think it's kind of a funny little thing, right? It's kind of a cool little maneuver. And there's actually a reason why this happens. But the problem with Sprite is basically the Eternals version of Loki. That's really what she is. Sprite causes problems, right? Sprite is just kind of a prankster, a trickster. There was one point where Sprite actually wiped the minds of all the Eternals, so it was kind of nuts in terms of how all that happened. But that's kind of a cat and mouse game that Sprite always plays with Icarus and the other Eternals, which is pulling pranks. They track down Sprite. Sprite maybe gets a little bit of a stern talking to or a slap on the wrist, and it kind of goes on, right? It's just sort of par for the course when it comes to the character. The biggest issue with this is that as Icarus is chasing down Sprite and kind of playing this little cat and mouse game, Sprite teleports to New York City. And when Sprite gets there, suddenly everything is brand new. Now, a lot of this is because of the fact that Sprite has more or less been backed up from a previous memory that Sprite had. The result of this is that while Sprite has experienced all this before, the idea of humanity in its current form is known to Sprite. Sprite doesn't remember, right? Just because of the fact that again, the memories that she has here are from before she had essentially encountered any of the regular Earthlings in their current form. And so, by all standards of measurement, it's a whole new experience, and it's awesome. Because Sprite's like, look at the things that they've achieved. This is awesome. You know, this is cool. But it's also kind of Icarus catching up Sprite on a little bit of her history and saying, like, you have kind of caused problems in the past, and like, you literally tried to kill us all. Now, in the midst of this, they're met by the arrival of Iron Man. And this is a cool little moment here for a couple different reasons. One, Iron Man and Icarus have met so many times in Marvel Comics. This is not a new thing, right? It's not a brand new concept, but it's kind of cool because like Iron Man asks, like, are you gonna freak out again? And again, this ties into the deaths of the Eternals. And the reason for that is because with everything going on regarding the Dark Celestials, that Iron Man and Doctor Strange had actually sought out the Eternals because they regularly commune with the Celestials. If there's anyone on Earth who's an authority on the Celestials, it is the Eternals, right? They know each other intimately. And so the result of this is that the last time Iron Man saw Icarus, he was freaking out and like all the Eternals were killing each other. And so that's why it's kind of like, are you gonna kill each other again? You know, is that what's gonna happen? You know, it's like, no, we're good, man. And so it's kind of a funny little thing. And so ultimately Iron Man's like, okay, cool. By the way, man, give my number to Cersei, you know, because like she's kind of hot. And it's weird, right? Like it's a little weird. Like Iron Man's trying to get with a woman who's something like 10,000 years old or something along those lines. Probably older than that, maybe closer to like 20,000. We don't get a definitive date on how old Cersei is, but like she's old. Now in the midst of all this, essentially excess deviation is detected by Icarus. And the result is he and Sprite have to respond to it. Now, what's excess deviation? So the Eternals are constantly at war with the Deviants. They're always at war. And it's almost kind of like an internal alarm system to a degree, in the sense that if Deviants are in proximity, Eternals will pick up on it, and the Eternals will go and attack Deviants, but only under the condition that Deviants are essentially doing what they're not supposed to be doing. In this instance, a Deviant's captured a human being. Under normal circumstances, the kind of rule, the unofficial rule between the Eternals and the Deviants is you stay away, we stay away, right? So you guys stay down there in the underground and you do your thing, and we'll stay up here, but as soon as you guys step out of line, boom, we're there, right? And we'll put you guys right back in check again. We'll kill whoever we have to in the process. And it's almost kind of a sport, right? It's almost one of these things where it's just kind of like, okay, like, you know, this kind of narrative that's given is like, for Icarus, it would be a fight, right? For Sprite, it would be a game. But for them, but because it's something that they've always done, right? Like when Deviants deviate, Eternals correct. It's one of these things where it's like we lust for the chance to fight Deviants, right? It's just what they do. So like, that's one of the reasons why you kind of notice that the trickster nature of Sprite suddenly vanishes, and it's like, okay, now it's time to kill some Deviants. And like, it's a cool thing, right? Because ultimately they end up taking this Deviant out, and they save the human being, and then they take him back to the surface, and of course, they end up going back to Olympia. Now, Olympia is the capital city, and the reason why it's called that, because you would probably immediately associate this with the Greek god home of Olympus. This actually happened in the very early days. So the Eternals, following their creation, began to come to the realization that gods like Zeus and Hera, Athena, Apollo, Aphrodite, that they were basically meddling in the affairs of humanity. And while the job of the Eternals was to essentially guide and protect humanity, with them realizing what was going on, there wasn't enough going on there for them to like get involved, in the sense that like the Greek gods weren't just indiscriminately killing humans. They weren't really a credible threat to humanity. It was really more of them just kind of getting involved in humanity, right? So like Zeus running around and banging girls, right? And like Aphrodite banging dudes, right? That was essentially it, right? And so they took a passing curiosity. Eventually, a kind of alliance formed between the two groups, if for no other reason than the fact that one, they both operated on Earth, and two, the Eternals wanted to keep a closer eye on the Greek gods. Eventually, they became more allies than enemies or anything like that, but it's one of these kind of interesting instances where the Eternals sort of allied themselves more with one group than another, because you never really saw the Eternals spending a lot of time on Asgard and hanging out with like Odin and Loki and Thor and those kind of guys, largely because Asgard's in its own pocket dimension outside of Earth, so you literally have to leave Earth and travel to a different dimension to get to it. But nonetheless, it's one of these kind of interesting situations, because once they arrive there, because Sprite is effectively meeting Zuros for the very first time, or at least the first time since Sprite's return, it's kind of one of those things of, hey, like, make sure you pay proper respect when you get to the Prime Eternal. The problem with this is they come across Fostos. Fostos, of course, being somebody who's not really a pacifist, but he's not really huge on war, but is really more of just like the technology guy, the Eternals, who essentially reveals that Zuros has been killed, right? Somebody killed Zuros. They effectively teleported in and teleported out. But the crazy thing about this is, despite Eternals being nearly invulnerable and being exceedingly difficult to kill, somebody crushed the head of Zuros with their bare hands. And that's why it's like, okay, who in the hell did this, right? Like, who in the world could have done this? Now, at this point, you get to Druid. Druid is just kind of a dick, and at one point was an enemy of the Eternals, like their main foe. But it's one of these things where initially the question is like, could it have been Sprite? But immediately people are just kind of like, no. Like, one, Sprite's not strong enough to do that. And two, while Sprite causes problems, I mean, Sprite wouldn't kill the Prime Eternal, would she? But Druid actually pinpoints directly to Icarus, and is like, Icarus was the previous Prime Eternal, and Icarus, last I saw, was none too happy about the fact that the Unimind determined that Zuros would be the new Prime Eternal. This guy's got motive, he's got strength, he's got the ability to pull it off. Icarus at that point just headbutts the hell out of Druid, and it's just like, that's ridiculous, and then effectively just leaves. Now at this point, it's on the hunt for the person who did this, right? And so what they end up doing is basically teleporting to Titanos, the fallen capital of the Eternals. Now Titanos was the original capital of the Eternals. That's why it's considered fallen. It's more or less been an abandoned place. But once they get there, there's this kind of hunting around. There's this almost kind of excess deviation that's really felt by Icarus, but not quite. But at the end of the day, the question is, okay, this energy source that we've traced to this location, who has in effect like destroyed whatever Eternals were left here, there has to be something going on. And ultimately you end up having this kind of vision that's given to Icarus of some kid named Toby Robson, who ultimately ends up dying at 13 years old. And so it's kind of like, who in the world is this kid? And the response of Icarus is, I don't know this kid. I've never met this kid, you know, but at the end of the day, he's going to live, I'm going to save him. And that's when you get this kind of disembodied voice that says, more eternal blasphemy, an affront against the universe. All that live must die. When I'm done, there will be but a single thing that is eternal. And that thing will be death. The person who teleported to the Eternal base of operations, killed Zeros, then teleported here to Titanos and killed all the remaining Eternals here is Thanos. Thanos is literally going to do everything he can to wipe out every Eternal from existence. Why he's going to do that, we don't know. Alright, what's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are continuing on with our story on the Eternals, but there's a few things that I want to clear up here. Yes, this bit of a battle does face, or really has like Thanos facing off against the Eternals, more Icarus than the rest of the Eternals, but it's a battle between the Eternals and Thanos nonetheless. But I also want to kind of talk about Thanos and how he relates to the Eternals. Now, I know a lot of you guys who have been around my channel for a long time already know this, so kind of bear with me for a minute, because we got a whole bunch of new subscribers with the Icarus explained video that we did and so on. So Thanos is in and of himself an Eternal, but he's an Eternal with the deviant gene. So depending on what comic book fans you talk to, some people will say that he's just a deviant. Others will say that he's an Eternal with a deviant gene, and some will say he's a hybrid of both. The importance behind this is that Thanos is in some form or fashion tied into the genetic makeup of an Eternal. He was technically born to both Eternals. He was born to Suisan and Alars, both of whom are pure Eternals. So again, it's one of those weird little concepts. The reality of this is that we can really look at Thanos more as like a mutant among his own race. In the same way that like Wolverine's considered a mutant among the human race, that Thanos is the same way. That seemingly every Eternal has like a dormant deviant gene, but it just never seems to activate. And Thanos is the unique exception among his own people, where being born with the deviant gene, that deviant gene was a primary gene. That deviant gene was basically a dominant gene instead of a recessive gene, and that's why he looks the way he does. Now, Thanos being a member of the Eternals is exceedingly important, and the reason why is because Thanos being able to travel through the Eternal gates by way of the machine is something that can only truly be done by a person who is of pure Eternal blood. Now, a person who is not an Eternal can do it, but they have to be given passage by Eternals. Essentially, they have to be given the key to open the doors by the Eternals themselves. But the important thing here is that with Icarus having shown up at basically the ruins of Titanos, finding it more or less destroyed, and Thanos occupying that space, the two of them get into a battle. Now, something that I want to stress here, this is the first time in Marvel Comics that the Eternals and really Icarus himself has actually fought Thanos. This has never really happened before. And so in a lot of ways, you're kind of talking about what would normally be an even battle between two characters. But one thing to keep in mind, Thanos is banned from the realm of Mistress Death. He is effectively immortal. And so because of that, he has everything he needs in order to essentially survive whatever force he faces off against. Now, he's not immutable and indestructible. If his physical body is incapable of surviving an experience, he'll more or less die. That's one of those instances where like Drax the Destroyer comes into play, right? During Annihilation, Thanos was technically banned from the realm of Mistress Death, but Drax the Destroyer was able to kill him because it's a power imparted to Drax by the cosmic entity Kronos that Drax can kill Thanos. So it almost kind of triumphs or almost kind of trumps the power of Mistress Death. Not officially, in the sense that when Thanos was killed, his body simply ceased to function because his heart was ripped out. So don't try to compare it one for one. Like if Iron Man ripped out the heart of Thanos, would he also stay dead in that capacity? This is one of those instances when Marvel just kind of cooks the books for the purpose of telling a story. So it doesn't really apply universally across the board. It's what we call comic book logic. It's a plot device. It just exists to tell a story, right? So that's one of the unique aspects of Drax. But the important thing is the machine basically opens a portal and then their fight actually takes place through time. Now, while these two are fighting, I want to kind of explain the machine a little bit. So the machine, as it's described to us, was given to us in Eternals in 2006, but there really isn't much in the way of explanation regarding what the machine is. That is to say, we don't know if it was created by the Eternals. We don't know if it was created by the Celestials to control the Eternals. We don't really know or really have much information behind it. All we really know is the machine is both itself a physical device, but it also represents the system of the Eternals, right? Their hierarchy, how it is that they exist, the idea of bringing people back from the dead, different things like that. That's all part and parcel to the machine. And so the machine itself is kind of a coming together of smaller machines, in the sense that if you remember our last video, we talked about how there are different tribes of Eternals across the world, in the same way that you have like different tribes of Inhumans, different things along those lines. While you have Eternals in different locations, an Eternal in Titanos can travel through the gateway to an Eternal in Polaria, and much the same way with them going vice versa. And so it's smaller machines that make all that possible, and all those small machines make up the larger machine. So again, it's kind of weird, right? It's like how all 50 states make up the United States of America. It's the easiest way to understand that. Now, the important thing between the fight of these two is that Icarus was never going to win the fight with Thanos, right? That was never going to happen. And the reason why is because Icarus just doesn't have the power to pull this off. But at the end of the day, way, the fight between the two is such that Thanos overpowers Icarus and actually rips his head off, only for us to realize it was a construct created by the machine. But the reality of Thanos being able to pull this off is that 1, Thanos is temporarily incapacitated, and 2, Icarus and Sprite get out of there as fast as they can. Because if Thanos gets his hands on the real Icarus, he'll kill him, right? That's just the reality of the situation that we're facing off against, is that Thanos is just that much more powerful than the Eternals. And so following that, Icarus basically travels to Olympus, right? Basically where the Eternals are currently residing, and meets with the rest of them and effectively tells them Thanos is here on Earth and Thanos is the reason why all this happened. Now, I wouldn't go so far as to say the Eternals panic, but they do understand the threat of the situation. One of the other things they refer to Thanos as is the sin of Titan. During the original Thanos Rising storyline, and even before that, back in the day, it was kind of established by Jim Starlin, Thanos effectively eradicated all of his race on Titan, right? That there were a lot of Eternals who lived there. And during his journey, when he was manipulated by Mistress Death, he actually left Titan. And then eventually he came back with an army he had amassed and eradicated everybody there. It's considered a unconscionable sin for an Eternal to basically commit genocide against their own kind, to take out the entirety of the Eternals race, or at least those Eternals who lived on Titan. That was unheard of. Under normal circumstances, a crime like that, Thanos would be locked in the exclusion zone, but there was no one there to stop him, right? Thanos was of such a power to where nobody could really stand against him. And so that's why he's considered to be the sin of Titan, because Thanos is the Eternal who went awry, right? He's the Eternal who became a bad guy, blinked out half the life in the universe during the original Infinity Gauntlet story, has done things like that time and time again, where he's been a credible threat not just to Earth or even the Eternals on Titan, but to the universe as a whole. And so because of that, the question becomes, what are we going to do here? But the funny thing about this is that while Icarus pleads with the Eternals, some of them don't actually believe that Thanos is here, that surely somebody would have noticed if that was the case. And so it's one of these things where when Icarus says that Thanos had actually traveled through the Eternal Gates, they kind of say, well, Thanos is not a true Eternal. But the answer to that question is, if Thanos is not a true Eternal, how is he able to travel the Eternal Gates if nobody gave him permission to do so? And so only one of two things is possible here. Either we're basically looking at Marvel telling us Thanos is really a true Eternal, he just has the deviant gene, or the history of Thanos is still intact, in the sense that because he had the deviant gene, it's like putting iodine in a drop of water. It permeates and it kind of makes him an impure Eternal, and not a true Eternal, which is kind of what his history's sort of been, again, depending on what comic book fan you talk to and how Marvel interprets that. The important thing here is that if he's not necessarily a true Eternal, then it means somebody let him in. That means that there's basically a spy among their ranks or a traitor, and somebody is essentially letting him into this place. The other part of that is when they had traveled to the exclusion zone in an attempt to find out when Zeros was going to be resurrected due to the fact that he's the Prime Eternal, the news they get is that all the wardens in the exclusion zone are dead. There's nobody there to resurrect Zeros. And so in essence, the dead will stay dead. This is exceedingly important. And the reason why is because what it means is there's no resurrection for the Eternals. That Marvel, if the Eternals start dying over the course of the story, Marvel's effectively thinning the herd. If I'm a betting man here, the reason why Marvel will be doing this is because they're going to thin the roster down so the comic book roster matches the Marvel Cinematic Universe roster. It's kind of what Marvel Comics does now. Marvel follows the MCU as opposed to the MCU following Marvel. But again, it's kind of an interesting concept, because in the midst of all that, while all this kind of accusation is going on with regards to Druid and kind of pointing the finger at Icarus and saying, hey man, you've had time, you've had opportunity, you know, to take out Zeros so that you could kind of take your place back as the Prime Eternal if that's what you wanted to do. Maybe your anger or jealousy that Zeros replaced you as the Prime Eternal, whatever logic makes sense to you. And then you come to us with this story about how the sin of Titan, the mad Titan himself, Thanos, has somehow made his way to Earth with no one knowing he's here, and he's the one behind it all. What a convenient excuse, right? What a convenient finger to point that it's Thanos that caused all this. And so Cersei ultimately pops up and says, no, right? This is not going to happen. Even if there is some measure of truth to what you're saying, Druid, which there's not, but even if it was something like Icarus who did all this, now is not the time for Eternals to turn against Eternals. That's not what needs to happen here. The biggest problem with this that you have is kind of a bit of an emergency going on at the moment is the machine is effectively failing. That if a portion of the machine is damaged, then the entire machine is damaged. What's kind of going on here is that by virtue of Thanos, presumably Thanos, wiping out all those wardens in the exclusion zone and then destroying the portion of the machine that deals with resurrecting Eternals who have died, it's like pulling out the bottom piece on a Jenga set at the wrong time. It's only a matter before it all comes crashing down. And when that happens, because the machine is tied into the biosphere of Earth, if the machine fails, the biosphere of Earth fails. Basically, it becomes an uninhabitable planet. This, I would say, is something akin to a plot device to a degree, but not necessarily. At least that'd be kind of the throwaway or the immediate response. But the nature of the Eternals is that they are tied irrevocably into the existence of the Earth itself. And assuming the machine was created by the Celestials and left here to control the Eternals, what better way to do that than to tie the habitability of the planet into the machine itself, right? Keep the machine intact, make sure it runs like it's supposed to, and you'll continue to survive. It's one of those interesting concepts that Marvel sort of throws in there. And so ultimately the questions asked of the machine, who did this, right? Like, who gave Thanos the ability to travel here to Earth by way of the Eternal Gateways? And the response of the machine is, I can find no data on the exception. I'm unable to remove that exception. In effect, what it looks like is, again, one of two things. Either Thanos is a true Eternal and can travel from one gateway to the other, which they more or less said that can't be the case, or there's somebody who made an exception for Thanos and then wiped that exception from the database. So once Thanos was here, they removed the exception, and so as far as the machine's concerned, there was no exception, and so there's no exception to remove. So in essence, if there is a traitor, they snuck Thanos on board Earth to wipe out the rest of the Eternals. We don't necessarily know who that person is or why they would have done it. At the moment, because the story follows Icarus, there's really nothing he can do here, right? I mean, there is a little bit of speculation that Sprite might be involved, but nothing of any real seriousness here. And so at this point, it's really more of a whodunit mystery. Who brought Thanos to Earth, and why are they allowing Thanos to kill off all the various Eternals across the planet? And so what you end up doing is actually traveling to New York to Toby Robson, because as we saw in the previous story, there was a kind of vision that Icarus got, that Toby Robson had essentially been killed, and Icarus saw it as a failing of his. Now there is a kind of motivation behind this, which actually sort of jumps back to a previous moment in Icarus's life, when he had stumbled across a man who kind of existed on an island, and basically asked him, have you seen a monster? Of course, referring to the Deviants. And when the answer of the man is, I've never seen a monster like that, the only monster he has is a kind of fish, then he basically tells him, build a pyre here, and that when a monster comes, or when a deviant comes, light the pyre, and then I will respond. But because of the fact that no deviants came over the course of this man's life, this guy quite literally just sat there waiting for monsters to show up. They never did, and so he ended up just kind of dying here. Now Icarus eventually showed up when the man was basically buried by his family, and the pyre was lit in order to burn his body, and Icarus thought a monster had been summoned. This is really kind of designed to tie into the nature of Icarus himself. This is one of the things that we explained when we talked about his character explanation in the video that we did, which you'll find down in the description, that Icarus has lived for countless eons. And so what would be 90 years is just a blink of an eye in his life. It might be minutes as far as his mind comprehends it. And so the result of this is that when he tells this guy, stay here and light a pyre so that if the monsters ever return, then I'll be here to fight them, that this man's life was 90 years. For Icarus, it just felt like a matter of minutes. And so the people here, his family, just scream and cuss at Icarus because of the fact that basically this man wasted his life. He just sat there and just waited for monsters to show up, and they never did. But ultimately, a giant deviant arrives here, and it really kind of shines into sharp relief the fact that presumably over the course of this man's life, he told them of the mission that was given to him by what he perceived to be a god. And while they kind of wrote it off as being nonsense and ridiculous, in this moment, the man's words all hail supreme. But it's really a small comfort to his family because at the end of the day, he still wasted his life, right? And so again, that seems to be why Icarus is really looking to protect Toby Robson the way he is, because it's more or less kind of making amends for a previous failure over the course of his life. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with the Eternals and the hunt for Thanos. For those of you guys who aren't really sure, one, check out parts 1 and 2 down in the description. I've instructed my editors to start putting the parts down there. A lot of you guys were asking about that, and that's really kind of a mistake on my part, was to not include those, so I've had my guys start doing it. But parts 1 and 2 will kind of get you guys caught up. But the important thing here is basically somebody's been traveling around and killing Eternals, right? And Thanos made an appearance at both the end of the first issue and in the second issue where he fought Icarus, and the idea was that Thanos might be the person behind it. But the reality is they're kind of hunting and really looking at a lot of different possibilities, because what it means is that if Thanos showed up on Earth and Thanos really is the one responsible for doing it, and Thanos was able to show up on Earth through the Eternal Gates, then an Eternal had to have let him in the first place. And so the first part of this is finding the traitor. Then the second one is trying to deal with Thanos. But even for the Eternals and the power they possess, it's no small feat to take out Thanos. And in fact, they can't really even kill him. The best they could do would be to like find somebody to take him into space, lock him away in the kiln, and that would be it. And that probably wouldn't happen because the Eternals don't really operate in that way. They might end up just kind of locking him away in the exclusion zone, and that may end up being it. But what we end up doing here is picking up with Thena. Now, Thena is an interesting member of the Eternals, and there's a lot of cool history there, but she's actually woken up in the Lumeria city of the Deviants. Now, for those of you guys who are kind of unfamiliar with this, I want to talk about this for a minute, right? For those of you guys who are unfamiliar with the history of the Eternals, and we don't need to go into it all, right? Well, I've got videos that run over the origin of the Eternals and where they come from and all that kind of stuff. The idea behind this was that before the Deviants attacked the Celestials in the second host, that Lumeria was the capital city of the Deviants, and in a lot of ways, it was the capital of the world, right? Lumeria was a huge trading hub, and so those humans who were not enslaved by the Deviants would use Lumeria as a way to like trade goods and different things like that. It was a huge hub. The result of this is once the Deviants had attacked the Celestials, that the Celestials had sunk Atlantis and the capital city of Lumeria. And so the result of this is one of the last bastions of the Deviants. Now, as far as how this equates to like the Atlanteans living on Atlantis, from what I've seen in Marvel Comics over the years, and I haven't read every single appearance of the Deviants, so don't quote me on this, but they're more or less as kind of like a loose sort of ceasefire between the Atlanteans and the Deviants, in the sense that they just don't really attack each other. Most of that's because of the fact that if they ever went to war, that it would just be a slaughter on both sides, right? The Atlanteans are very powerful, but so are the Deviants, right? And it would literally just lead to an outright massacre. So it's one of those kind of you stay away, I stay away kind of situations. But the important thing about this is that Athena is suddenly met by the arrival of Cersei and the other Eternals, who are here to kind of question her about what's going on. Now, one of the big questions you're likely asking yourself is that if Athena and the Eternals are enemies of the Deviants, then why is she banging a Deviant? And we'll actually answer that here in a minute, because there was a really cool story that was created back in 1991 by Roy Thomas called The Eternals, The Herod Factor, and it actually kind of establishes a few things about them, which I think will end up being kind of a plot point when it comes to the movie. But the important thing here is that Athena, as you imagine, sounds a lot like Athena of Greek mythology. And the reason for this is because back in the early days of the Eternals, even though they weren't necessarily gods, humanity believed them to be gods. And so the result is that usually whenever you read Marvel, it's kind of a consistent statement among the Eternals that humanity confused them for gods. But because of the fact that the Eternals were designed to safeguard humanity, and when they went back to undertaking that role after the second celestial host and the almost wholesale slaughter of the Deviants, that the Eternals started watching what was going on around the Earth. And when you ended up having like the Olympian gods, right? So like Zeus and Hercules and Hera and Athena and all them, when they started getting involved in the affairs of men, the Eternals took interest in it. And so what ended up happening is a kind of pact was struck between the Eternals and the Olympian gods, where it was more or less like the Eternals would operate as quote unquote the agents of the Olympians on Earth. And so because Athena at that point was known as Azura, and she was believed to be Athena, that this basically resulted in people calling her Athena. And so that's one of the instances where a kind of confusion was struck between humanity and the various gods that existed. But the important thing here is that the whole reason why they're kind of asking this question is because normally Eternals don't spend time with the Deviants, right? It doesn't work that way, like they're enemies. And so what ended up happening here is after Azura was reborn, much in the same way Icarus was, that she had traveled to essentially visit her father, and the idea is that she wanted to quote unquote make the Deviants better, in the sense that she didn't really want to be enemies with them anymore, that instead it was kind of like we can work alongside them and we can make them better people. Her father, of course, was like, no. And as one of the original Eternals, or I guess maybe the first member of the second generation of Eternals, so the son of one of the original Eternals, that wasn't gonna happen, right? Zuras was just avidly against that, right? He's like, no, the Deviants are enemies, they stay enemies, like we kill Deviants, Deviants kill Eternals, that's just the way that it is, right? We don't mix like that. That's not how things are supposed to be. But ultimately, Athena was like, no. And then she made this kind of offhanded comment, like, I'll kill you, father, and you would be better off dead. And so because of that statement, even though it was kind of an idle threat, and there really wouldn't be an instance where Athena would seemingly kill her dad, the result is that it led the Eternals to question this, right? To ask, are you the one who killed Zuras? And that's what has kind of really brought for the first time to the attention of Athena that, oh my god, Zuras is dead. And so following that, you jump directly over to Icarus, right? Now this is kind of a subplot for Icarus and kind of showing what's going on with him. This was par for the course when it comes to the Eternal story. So those of you guys who are curious about this, it's par for the course. And that's one of the reasons why Kieran Gillen's run is so cool, because it really falls rank and file with like the old Roy Thomas stuff, right? It just, even like the old Jack Kirby stuff, it just falls almost perfectly in line. Icarus was far and away the most popular of the Eternals because he had the most going on with the regular mortal world. And so to see him more or less doing this same thing here, it's just classic Eternal storytelling. It's got a different face on it, and it's got a little bit, the art's certainly better than the old Eternal stuff. I know you old school Jack Kirby fans are gonna be pissed, but I gotta say, I prefer Esad Ribic over Jack Kirby. But nonetheless, it's one of these things where he's actually here because if you guys recall in the last video that we did, that Toby Robson was a vision that Icarus saw, where it was, I need to keep this kid protected. And again, one of the things that we talked about was that with Icarus's history in Marvel Comics, from his character standpoint, there's been a lot of failings on his behalf, right? That the biggest failing is really like the Eternals not really safeguarding humanity the way they were supposed to originally, hence the reason why humanity in its early days was enslaved by the Deviants. Now, for the most part, Icarus wasn't really around at that exact point in time. There wasn't really anything he could do at that exact point in time. But the important thing here is that with the second human celestial hosts and everything just kind of popping off. That following that, the Eternals underwent the role they were supposed to, and Icarus was a part of that aftermath. And so with that being the case, one of the things that we talked about in a previous video as well is that because his lifespan is so long, and because he doesn't really grasp what it means to tell a mortal a particular thing that may take up years of their life, that in this instance, he had told a person, stay here and watch for monsters. And when a monster comes, then light the pyre. And because the early days of humanity was such that they confused the Eternals for gods, this guy felt like it was a command that he was given by a god, and he was going to follow it. And so he basically wasted his whole life. But Icarus saw that and realized, okay, you know, for me, I'm basically immortal. I will essentially live forever. And even if I die, I'll be resurrected. I'll come back. The important thing here is that for Icarus, kind of looking at all this, the idea of basically guarding Toby Robinson from a potential death that he saw based on his vision is really not him protecting Toby because Toby has any real value. It's even stated here. He doesn't know what the importance of Toby is. He's doing it because he's trying to make up for past misdeeds. And that's kind of an important thing when it comes to Icarus. And it's one of the things that made Icarus so interesting, even if the Eternals themselves as a whole were not necessarily that interesting, is because it was really his involvement and his desire to make up for past sins, right? For mistakes that he'd made in the past, to try to fix those retroactively by doing the right thing now. It's one of the things that we talked about with Icarus Explained. He took the name Icarus after his son because his son died. And so long as he has this name, his son will seemingly live forever. So it's that kind of theme that goes on and on with his character. And so following this, you have Thena, who actually communicates with the machine, right? We talked about that in the previous video. This kind of complex machine-based system that we don't really know much about, whether it was created by the Celestials, the Eternals, or what have you, but essentially communes with it and realizes one part, the resurrection system of the machine was destroyed, and that two, Zeros really is dead. And so those Eternals who die, there's seemingly no way to bring them back. And so following this, you have this kind of discussion and even a little bit of conversation between Thena and Cersei, and of a bit of a flashback from about 100,000 years ago. And the way this plays out is you end up finding out that Thena had at one point been in a relationship with a deviant by the name of Zygo. And there's this kind of thing where she says that Zygo is not like Crow. Now the important thing here, and again, this goes back to the Herod storyline, the Herod factor from Roy Thomas, is that most of you guys know Crow is kind of like the warlord, right? The general who led the deviants, that he and Thena were in a relationship at one time. And they kind of ended up getting back together knowing that it wasn't necessarily going to work. But Thena has seemingly always kind of had a thing for deviants, right? Now, it's not as though Marvel Comics paints the picture that she likes bad boys, but it's one of these things where she seemed to always kind of have this desire to like make the deviants better, right? To improve the deviants. The reality is that they're a culture with a half measure of a DNA system, right? So every generation lives a shorter lifespan than the generation before it, right? It's just one of those things where it just kind of falls apart as the generations go on. And so because of that, you can't really fix the deviants per se. You can't make them better. It's quite literally baked into their genealogy. You might be able to find a few here and there who will break off and become good guys, but for the most part, they're always kind of twisted. And so the result of this is that with Thena kind of being in love with Zygo and having a relationship with him, she's almost kind of blind to this idea that like deviants are deviants and you can't change their way. It's just how they are. They will use you for whatever ends they can, but at the end of the day, their heart is built on the foundation of destruction and torture and pain and torment. It's all they know. It's what they were bred to be. It's how they are. And so in order to prove this point, what you end up having is Cersei, who takes Thena to this kind of hidden base, right? This kind of hidden area that Zygo was using. And come to find out, what he'd been doing is harvesting the organs of other deviants and even other beings out there in the mortal world for the purpose of trying to make himself into an Eternal. And it's one of these things where Cersei says, like, you can't fix them, right? Like, no matter what you do, at the end of the day, he doesn't necessarily see you as anything special. He sees you as a means to an end. His desire is to perfect the process of turning somebody into an Eternal. And then when the time comes, he was going to kill you and he was going to harvest your organs and he was going to make himself into one of us and use you to do it. And with that kind of betrayal of the heart coming into play, and Thena realizing that there is no way, right? That like Zygo had to die, but like there is no way to make them better. She kind of abandons this idea of ever loving a deviant, right? Of ever being in love with a deviant. We of course know that's not the case, but kind of jumping back to the modern day, this is designed to sort of show the struggle that Thena's had over the course of her entire lifespan, but two, the kind of animosity that exists between the two. And that's an important thing to understand here, because if you look at the Eternals with a kind of cursory glance, they're essentially a band of individuals with incredible powers, and they kind of hang out and do some stuff, and for the most part, all's quiet on the Western Front. Now, there's a lot of infighting there, right? I mean, when you've lived for 100,000 years, you're bound to have a few disagreements. You're bound to have a few skirmishes between you and other people. And that's one of the things where it's kind of like, I mean, yeah, they all sort of exist, but like in a lot of ways, they don't necessarily like each other, but they stand in unison because they kind of have to. But it's one of the things where Thena kind of looks at everything that's what's going on and been like, it's kind of like, look, the fourth celestial host, the final celestial host came and went a long time ago, right? Like, that's what killed us, is we learned from the final celestial host that we were just here to more or less safeguard humanity so they could be, fodder, more or less, so that the celestials could destroy the world, and then like whatever the energy signature of Earth was would go to the Horde. Right now, I know we've kind of talked about the Horde before. For those of you guys who are curious, we can make a video about that if you want me to, right? I can explain like the Horde, the Eternals, all that kind of stuff. I can make sense of all that. Let me know if that's something that you guys are interested in. But the overall gist is, at least as far as Thena goes, is we don't owe anything to the Celestials anymore. And so come to find out, what ends up happening here is Druid is basically contacted by Cersei, or at least he contacts her, and kind of asks like, are you alone? And she's like, I mean, I'm here with Eternals, but like they can't necessarily hear what I'm saying. And he ends up saying that like he'd returned to Polaria, right, to receive orders from the Supreme Falcon. Now, a little bit of history here, right, to give you guys some context. Even before the Eternals had kind of like abandoned their role of safeguarding humanity and then were ultimately forced to after the second celestial host, when the Eternals first began to sort of emerge after the celestial modification of human genes, they actually spread across the world in different factions. And this is why you have the celestial machine that has different locations across the world. And so while you had Eternals in Olympia, which was kind of like their capital city, so to speak, you also had Eternals in Polaria. Now, it's not as though the Eternals in Polaria completely ignored Eternals in Olympia. They were aware of the others' existence, and they would cross over if they needed to, right? Like they would come to the aid of others. It was just one of those where it was just like different people living in different locations. And so the result of this is that during the second celestial host, what had happened is you had Erishan the Judge, who had shown up on Earth along with a host of the Celestials to judge it, right? And then you had the Deviants who had attacked the Celestials. And so what ended up happening here is you had one of the Celestials who actually wanted to cleanse the entirety of the world, believing that the entire process of modifying human genes had more or less been a failure. Erishan the Judge blocked the order, and the assumption was that Erishan the Judge was screwing up. And the reason why was because the Celestials operated in such a capacity so that once they made a decision, it was kind of unified, right? And the idea was if an experiment was deemed to be a failure, they would just cleanse the whole world. It's how they'd done it on a multitude of different planets. The fact that the Earth was being treated as an exception seemed like an error in their programming as it had been designed by the Fulcrum. And so when this one Celestial stepped in and tried to effectively destroy Erishan the Judge, that Celestial was cast out, right? It was basically defeated, and then it was left on Earth. And then in turn, all the very essence and the technology and all the means by which a person could effectively weaponize or resurrect that Celestial was put in the hands of Vulcan. Now, as most of you guys know, or have probably guessed by now, that particular Celestial was Tiamu, the Dreaming Celestial. And that was how it was basically locked away on Earth, which is why you're likely going to see the Dreaming Celestial in the Eternals film. I don't know if you are, I'm assuming you are, but again, whoever it is that's going through, presumably Thanos, and killing all these different Eternals had landed in Polaria, and they killed every single one of the Eternals on Polaria as well, which includes Vulcan. The assumption here is that now, at this point, the leader of the Eternals falls directly on Druid. And the reason for that is because Druid is basically an heir to the throne of Polaria. And so now the assumption is if all those Eternals had been killed in that location, was Druid the one who did it? So again, it's one of these things where it just kind of bounces around from person to person to person. We ultimately know that Thanos seems to be the one to have done all this, but is it Druid or somebody else who's enabling Thanos and actually pointing him in the direction of these different locations and taking them all out? What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with the Eternals. Now, here's the funny thing about this. One of the big on-running theories about the Eternals in the Marvel Cinematic Universe is that they're basically robots who are designed to serve a purpose, and that now that the Earth has superheroes, that their purpose is effectively served, and there's not really a need for them anymore. This story is going to kind of confirm that a little bit, but sort of in the way that you don't expect. But for those of you guys who are really unfamiliar with this, and we kind of talked about this a little bit, the Eternals had been dead for quite some time, and that the machine, which is a relatively new invention in Marvel Comics, had basically begun the process of resurrecting them in the exclusion zone. Now, the exclusion zone is a long-standing concept, right? It's how the Eternals usually always end up coming back. But we didn't really know who was killing the Eternals, but we largely believed it was Thanos, because Thanos has just kind of been here popping in and out. And then there's just been kind of like these bodies of Eternals sort of laying in his wake. And the big question is, if it really is Thanos who's killing the Eternals, why? Is it just some basic motivation that Thanos harbors a vendetta against the Eternals? He is basically an Eternal himself with a deviant sentient gene, albeit from a different sect, in the same capacity that like people in Africa are humans, but they don't share American culture. So the kind of question is, why would he be going after these guys, right? What's the motivation for hunting after him? The other part of this is that the Eternals usually always existed in isolation, although occasionally they would cross over with other superheroes in events like the Onslaught Saga, maybe Secret Wars or something along those lines. You never really saw them, really get involved in the affairs of mortal men. For Cersei herself, her big question here is to kind of get involved with Tony Stark to find out what the Avengers know, to find out if there's any information they have that she can gather, because one of the biggest things to know is that with Iron Man having previously become aware of the fact that the Eternals have basically returned, now it's going to turn into Iron Man, if for no other reason than his own curiosity, exploring what's going on in the world with regards to the Eternals, right? So the Avengers may have done their own investigation, Iron Man, Mr. Fantastic of the Fantastic Four, Reed Richards, they may have done their own thing. So the idea of Cersei is to get what information they can from them, see if she can't apply it to her own information, and then come to a stronger conclusion. The other part of this is, again, the character of Toby. Now, Toby is this person that Icarus, who's kind of like the main hero of the Eternals, had this premonition about that he was ultimately going to die. And the goal of Icarus is to save Toby, right? To kind of keep Toby alive. Of course, with everything popping off, what Icarus had done is he had tasked Sprite with keeping an eye on Toby, basically making sure that Toby's protected by whatever threats happen to be out there, and that if the time comes when a threat does emerge, for example, Thanos showing up and trying to attack Toby, that Sprite would hold off the force of Thanos as best as she possibly could, and then alert Icarus, who of course would return and try to understand what's going on here. And so what you end up getting is this interesting scenario where a lot of it comes down to Druid. Now, Druid is kind of interesting when it comes to the Eternals. The reason why I say that is in the past, he's largely been a main enemy of the Eternals, but it's one of these things where because of the fact that different Eternals are being attacked, right? Eternals in Polaria, who are not necessarily enemies of Eternals in Olympia, but the two groups don't get along, because of the fact that Eternals are being attacked basically across the board, regardless of what faction they're from, then it's kind of like, okay, all hands on deck, everybody band together, and Druid trying to understand what's going on. But make no mistake, Druid's very similar to like Loki in the Eternals mythos, in the sense that, yeah, he's kind of working with the good guys, but he usually has his own ambitions, his own goals and drives, and he really gets immersed in like subterfuge, things like that. And that's why when he is approached by like Athena and all these Eternals here that are kind of questioning whether or not he had a hand in this, the fact that the Polaria Eternals are dead, that he was a servant of them, and so if he's looking to essentially begin the process of wiping out, quote unquote, all the competition, whatever his motivation happens to be, why not start there and then work his way out into other Eternals? That ultimately they kind of come to the realization they didn't have a hand in it, right? There's nothing about this that he had any involvement in. And the reason they know that is because Thanos appears and Thanos starts crushing all of them. And that's the important thing to get here, right? When it comes to Thanos, he is intriguing in relation to the Eternals. The Eternals themselves are already hugely powerful, right? Thanos is like a mutant among his own Eternal race, meaning he's more powerful than the other Eternals. And so Thanos showing up here and facing off against these guys, it shows there's not really a whole lot they can do, right? They face off against him as best they can, but Thanos is just too overwhelming and too powerful. Now, this comes from a combination of different things. One, it's the physiology of Thanos, his durability, strength, speed, stamina, all that kind of stuff, but also the enhancements he's made to himself, technological modifications, as well as, gifted enhancements that were given to him by Mistress Death, right? Some measure of immortality or kind of definitive immortality, although recently he's basically died and, somehow he managed to come back here, different things along those lines. The only real savior they have here comes in the momentary action of Druid, who uses his telepathy to kind of lock Thanos inside of his own mind. And you get this amazing moment, right, where Thanos is like, really? Like, I've matched wits against cosmic beings, right? And he has. Thanos has gone toe to toe with like Galactus, Silver Surfer, people whose telepathic powers are well beyond that of Druid and the Eternals. And he's like, you really believe that this little trick will somehow stop me? And the response of Druid is no, but it'll delay you sufficiently enough to where other Eternals can arrive and then we can all take you down. And he's like, that's ridiculous. Like, I've held the power of the Infinity Gauntlet in my hand and wiped out half the life in the universe. I promise you, I can easily overcome you. And ultimately, while Thanos does get his hands on Druid and in the moment goes to kill him, all these other Eternals start showing up and Thanos does the only thing he can do, which is basically teleport away. But this essentially frees Druid of any suspicion, right? That Thanos is going around and killing different Eternals. His next targets were these guys right here, and Druid effectively saved the day. And so what you end up getting here is Athena basically saying, like, we have to get Icarus. We have to go after the Forgotten One. We have to go after Gilgamesh. Now, the idea of referring to Gilgamesh as the Forgotten One who leads the Forgotten is really intriguing here. And this is Kieran Gillen kind of building on some of the concepts of the Eternals over the years, and then making some modifications conscience of his own, right? Gilgamesh is one of the Eternals who's been around for an exceedingly long time, but unlike a lot of the other Eternals who kind of adopted their own names as time went on, Gilgamesh didn't necessarily do so. He's really adopted multiple names over the course of his existence. The big difference here, and the reason why you kind of have them referred to as the Forgotten, we'll talk about here in a second, but before we do, I want to switch back over to Druid for a second, because what we end up having is Druid by himself, and then a portal opens up behind him, only for Thanos to re-emerge. And that's when we find out that while Thanos is not necessarily the one who's killing Eternals at the behest of Druid, that again, much like we would expect from characters like Loki, or a lot of these guys who engage in subterfuge and have their own agendas, that Druid is much the same way. That Druid instead basically asked Thanos, I mean, yeah, sure, there's a traitor among our ranks. The big question to ask here is, why wouldn't you come to me? If anybody's best suited to betray the Eternals and to help you carry about this mission of destroying the Eternals, it would be me. I'm the best person suited for that. So let's work together and see what we can work out. Now, following that, you switch over to Cersei meeting with Tony Stark. And this is kind of a funny thing, because as the two of them are talking, one of the things that she had mentioned to Fostos, really when they were kind of talking before she'd come here, was that Tony Stark's easily manipulated. And that's true. Tony Stark's had a thing for Cersei for a long, long time, but also understanding Tony Stark the way that she does, she's like, I mean, this guy's ego and his lust are like the two big things that rule him, right? Everything else is secondary. So it's very easy to take advantage of that, right? She's like, I'll basically, like manipulate him a little bit. I will seduce him, and then I'll try to find out, what he knows about the other Avengers or information they have that can help us with this goal of trying to figure out, what's going on with this machine or what have you, who's killing Eternals. And then we'll basically call it a day, right? The funny thing here is that, of course, using her powers, she ends up effectively shutting down the nervous system of Tony Stark, and then just kind of says like, I have to make a few edits here, and kind of makes a statement and saying Thanos has been killing my fellow Eternals. Thanos is behind the destruction of the machine, and Thanos will rule the earth when I'm done. And then suddenly she's attacked by the Forgotten One, right? The Forgotten One just comes out of nowhere and immediately goes after Cersei. Now, of course, Icarus shows up just in the nick of time. When she says like, Icarus, now I need you, Icarus arrives here and then basically offers a distraction and starts facing off against the Forgotten One, only for us to find out that what Cersei had done by basically manipulating the nervous system of Tony Stark heard her say, Thanos has been killing my fellow Eternals. Thanos is behind the destruction of the machine, yada, yada, yada. That what the Forgotten One heard is, I'm the one who's killing Eternals. I'm the one behind the destruction of the machine. And so ultimately, this is what drew him out. And it was all really a ruse, right? It was the only real way to get the Forgotten One to show up here, because the Forgotten One doesn't just show up out of nowhere. More specifically than that, the question that always kind of had to be asked here is, if the Eternals are there to safeguard humanity, then who watches the Watchmen, right? Who watches the Eternals? And that's what the Forgotten do. Now, the Forgotten are kind of like the police of the Eternals to a degree, where they've kind of taken it among themselves to ensure that if there are any Eternals that abuse their power in relation to humanity, try to force them into subservience, different things like that, in the same way the Deviants did in the early days of human history, that the Forgotten would kill those Eternals. They would destroy them, right? Because they deviate from their purpose. And so the Forgotten One, Gilgamesh, kind of overhearing Cersei saying, I'm the one who's killing Eternals, I'm the one who's responsible for the destruction of the machine, means that's my target, right? So that's why he went after Cersei. Now, of course, once everything kind of calms down between the Forgotten and between Icarus, then it's kind of a conversation point, right? Then it's a talking point, right? It's kind of like, okay, let's kind of figure out what's happening and what's going on here. The funny thing about this is that because the motivations and really the purpose of the Forgotten are to keep the Eternals in check, then if their goal is to kill Eternals that basically deviate from their roles, they're the next best suspect here, right? If somebody's going around killing Eternals, then maybe it's the Forgotten and the Forgotten One, right? Gilgamesh, maybe he's the one that's doing it, right? Like, it's literally, I mean, at this point, it's turned into a witch hunt, is really all it is, right? It's a gigantic witch hunt, just going after people arbitrarily because they satisfy whatever motivation needs to be satisfied for why the Eternals think things are happening. And so that's what's going on here, right? Going after Gilgamesh, the Forgotten, all those guys, it's kind of like, you guys kill Eternals, right? You guys are the ones who are responsible for the deaths of various versions of us. Why wouldn't you be doing it now? And if you are, why? What's your motivation? What have we of the Eternals done to basically bring this wrath that you have to wipe out so many of us? What's the point? And the response to the Forgotten is, it's not us. We're not the ones who are killing you guys. We're not the ones who are destroying you guys. That's not our goal and our motivation. Like, that's not the case. Like, somebody else has a hand here. Somebody else is involved here in doing these things, right? So stop blaming us. The big kicker about all this is that when they take him to really an aspect of the machine that the Forgotten One kind of goes through, right? Gilgamesh starts going through and analyzing and saying, yeah, like, it's been sabotaged. Like, any scientist of note would have found this just by looking at it, right? I mean, I even told Fostos how to sabotage the machine. The whole entire time this has been going on, Fostos has no idea how any of this happened. Fostos is like, I don't know what's going on with the machine. I don't know how it's been sabotaged, but supposedly he's been working on the machine trying to fix it the entire time. The reality is he's been trying to destroy it, right? And that's the thing, like Fostos is just gaining the trust of the Eternals. That's all it is, right? Just kind of building on that trust aspect because he's the most loyal. He's a pacifist. He doesn't like war. He doesn't like conflict. He doesn't like to get involved in massive affairs like this. So Fostos being the one behind what is in effect the deaths of all these Eternals takes all the other Eternals by surprise, right? It blows them away. And then of course, Fostos makes contact with Thanos and says like there's people coming to the exclusion. They'll get here fast. You have to stop them. You have to let me continue my work. Now the question becomes, why is Thanos working with Fostos, right? Like why are these two guys teaming up? They're enemies, right? Thanos is considered the sin of the Eternals. No Eternal would willingly work with Thanos. So why in the world are they working together here? And so ultimately what you end up finding out is the main goal in the destruction of the machine by Fostos is to destroy the Eternals, but it's not to destroy the Earth. But keep in mind, one of the things that we talked about in a previous video is that while we don't have a whole lot of history about the nature of the machine, in fact, we don't really know anything about it. What we know is that the machine is tied to the Earth. So if the machine is destroyed, the Earth will be destroyed. Fostos doesn't seem to know this. It just seems to be from his perspective that the Eternals themselves are tied to the machine, that by destroying the machine, that destroys the Eternals' ability to resurrect. And then from there, it's just using Thanos to destroy what remains of the Eternals, and then there's no way for the Eternals to come back. So why wipe out the entire Eternal race? Switch over to 1 month earlier when Thanos is basically brought back by Fostos. And what he basically says is like, you work for me now, right? Like I have found a way to bring you back, but this body is not a permanent body. This is a temporary body, but understand, if you basically fulfill these tasks as I'm assigning them to you, then I will bring you back, right? I will resurrect you properly, and you'll actually be back in your full form with your full power. If you deviate against me, if you violate any of the policies that I'm giving you, if you work against me, then I will destroy you. I will make sure that the body that you inhabit dies, and you'll never ever come back again. And that's why Thanos is working for Fostos, because Thanos, of course, seeks to return to life. It was always one of the contradictory aspects of Thanos. For a person who is so incredibly in love with Mistress Death and is a complete and total nihilist who believes that life is meaningless and death is the only real valuable commodity that exists out there, why is he always hankering to come back to life? Why is he always hankering to return? It was one of those things that didn't really make a whole lot of sense. You would think that a guy who's obsessed with Mistress Death would just off himself, right? And just be like, I'm gonna kill myself so I can stay with Mistress Death. A lot of that seems to be predicated on the events of Infinity Gauntlet, which solidified this idea that Thanos would go as far as to wipe out half the life in the universe to gain the affection of Mistress Death. That and the fact that he's so popular, nobody wants to see him dead. They want to see him alive. They want to see stories with him. So you kind of end up having to do that, because how interesting could a story about Thanos be if he's just standing around with Mistress Death in the afterlife not doing anything? While this whole great big huge fight is going on between Thanos and the Eternals, they're doing everything they can to face off against him, and they're doing it quite well, right? That's one of the funny things, is that as powerful as Thanos is, one-on-one with most any Eternal, he's gonna overcome them. But given the wide and varying powers that the Eternals have, when they work in unison and they come together, albeit without the Unimind, that Thanos it's a difficult task for him to overcome all of them, especially somebody like Cersei, who has a power of transmogrification, right? Matter manipulation. It's one of these things where it's not easy to overcome that, especially when she can use it to modify the body of Thanos and to cause all kinds of problems with him. Now, Thanos' healing factor, his durability, his strength, and just his general wherewithal, right? His just drive to succeed is oftentimes what allows him to overcome the Eternals, right? That he's just so single-minded to a task, it's wildly difficult to overcome that. The problem, and the one thing that Fostos didn't account for, is that as he begins the process of destroying the machine, that the machine doesn't hold as well as he thought he would. And basically, the beginning of the end of the world starts. And so what ends up happening is that as everything starts falling apart, then suddenly the machine it kind of serves its purpose, where it basically teleports everybody all over the world. That the machine itself is going awry. It's not supposed to function that way. The machine's broken, right? It's like if your computer gets a virus, I guess, and just starts spitting pop-ups, right? It's not functioning the way that it's supposed to. It doesn't work as intended. And so the result of this is that Icarus gets to the machine as fast as he possibly can. And then suddenly, where you end up having Fostos, who tries to offer some insight to Icarus on how to fix things, that ultimately you have Druid, who pops up and then modifies the mind of Fostos. And so basically this is designed to ensure that whatever Fostos says will not be taken seriously mysteriously. There's a secret that he holds that he intends to spill to the rest of the Eternals, and that Druid doesn't want anybody to actually know what's going on, or seemingly that's the case. Now, of course, the actions of Icarus, of course, work in basically keeping the machine contained, right? Keeping the machine controlled, and then in turn ensuring that everything kind of goes back to normal and the world doesn't end, right? Which is pretty straightforward. Then attention turns to Fostos, right? What's going on here? Now, that's where things are intriguing, because the ultimate goal here of Druid is that at the end of the day was to keep Thanos alive, right? That's what kind of goes on here. I mean, sure, it was the secret that Fostos harbors, but keeping Thanos alive was another part of this. And that's why with Thanos being here and them realizing that he was the one who brought Thanos back, it's like, no. To destroy Thanos, all I have to do is just activate the thing inside his body. But before he can finish this, he realizes he can't remember how to stop Thanos. He can't remember how to kill Thanos. And so in effect, Druid has solidified Thanos' full return to the Marvel Universe, or at least that seems to be the case anyway. Most likely in a more stripped down version in terms of power than what we're used to kind of bring him further in line with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But we don't definitively know that, right? We don't definitively know if that's the case, because even Thanos' current form is left kind of ambiguous in the sense that last we saw him, he had kind of been defeated by Cersei and was just like in this sort of bubbly, weird looking form. And that was basically it. It seemed as though his physical form had been destroyed. But again, we don't definitively know. Of course, we'll find out here in the next story arc. The big secret that Fostos is hiding, though, is the nature of the Eternals, the cost of their immortality. This is a really, really cool aspect of the Eternals mythos, that with Thanos having been defeated, what Fostos basically reveals here is that as far as the Eternals are concerned, that whenever they die, the machine resurrects them, right? They go to they're kind of reborn in the exclusion zone. They're given I guess a duplicate of their previous body, and they're resurrected in that body. But there is a cost to immortality. The cost of this is that where Icarus had sacrificed his life to preserve the machine does resurrect him, and Toby dies. The person he was supposed to save ends up perishing. That's the cost of resurrection. Every time an Eternal comes back to life, a human dies. Every single time without fail. It's just the cost of eternal immortality. And so in effect, they are designed to save humanity while at the same time consuming humanity each time they're resurrected. Why the machine works this way, we don't know. That's the nature of the machine. We don't really know definitively who designed it this way. Presumably the Celestials did, but it seems kind of weird the Celestials would task the Eternals with safeguarding humanity and then at the same time cost humanity every time the Eternals are resurrected, right? It's kind of a weird thing there. But at the end of the day, Zuros, of course, is brought back, and of course that leads to the death of a human. The Eternals also come to grips with that and saying, or at least as far as they're concerned, and the kind of statement they give to Zuros is, yes, we accept that, right? Like we accept the fact that this is just the role we play. This is the nature of things. But that's the big struggle when it comes to Cersei, when it comes to Icarus, when it comes to Athena and these guys is, well, we'll bring the Unimind together and we'll convince the Eternals, the rest of the Eternals to understand this is the price of immortality. But the response is kind of given here by Cersei is they don't care. Nobody else is going to care. At the end of the day, the response that the whole belief they have, Zuros and everybody else, is that humanity is beneath them. And so while they wouldn't necessarily let humanity succumb to their destruction at the hands of the Deviants, lest the Eternals face the wrath of the Celestials, that they're not going to go out of their way to protect humanity from like themselves or anything like that. So it's kind of sitting on this sort of borderline between letting humanity destroy themselves, allowing humanity to be sacrificed, and seeing themselves as being more important than humanity. And so the way, this kind of being perceived as the way of the Eternals is really more of a ruse by Icarus and all these guys. And what they end up doing is actually going to the capital city of Lemuria, the home of the Deviants. They're really their greatest enemy. And in turn, they say like, we come in peace to the changing people. We have no desire to wage a war with you guys. Instead, we want to join you. Help us be the changing people too. In essence, Icarus and this core group of Eternals are turning against the other Eternals. And the intention here is to join the Deviants, presumably to bring the downfall of all the Eternals. In essence, they seem to have bought in and understood the goal and the motivations of what Fostos was doing. And they've essentially come to this realization that the price that's paid for immortality is simply just too high. They're not willing to sacrifice innocent human lives to preserve their own lives. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. I love this Eternals run by Kieran Gillen. It's fantastic. It's really more of a cerebral story, right? It's really more of a thinking story as opposed to like a single action-packed story, but I love the way it's done. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments, and I will catch you all later. Peace.